Thank you, Ines, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting us here. I would like to say a couple of words how this interview came to be on our end. So I represent, as Ines said, Ukrainian TV network KONTAKT. And obviously, when we found out that Professor Marci Shore is the chair of European Intellectual History here in Toronto, I knew that our viewers would love to hear you. And so I invited Professor to the interview. And they invited us here, and little did I know that this interview is coming with an audience. So it's a new experience for us, but very exciting. And thank you for inviting us. My first question to Professor Shore. Tell us a little bit about your background and your choice of study. You studied Marxism and phenomenology.
Oh, okay. Well, my background is that I come from Allentown, Pennsylvania. There's a Billy Joel song about Allentown for those of you who are of the right generation to know that reference. And how I got involved is a very long story, but the short version of the story is that I was at an impressionable age in 1989. I was 17 when the Berlin Wall fell. And like my parents' generation, everybody remembers where they were when they heard that Kennedy was shot. You know, I remember where I was when I heard that the Berlin Wall fell. You know, and it was the seduction of the moment. I mean, it's very much a generational story. When I first went, you know, to Eastern Europe, it was full of young Americans just like myself, running around not knowing what they were doing. Most of them eventually got over it and went home and got a life. I never quite did. Somehow I stayed and I learned languages and I got increasingly involved. But it was very much the result of the moment that pulled me in. The fact that I was the last generation growing up in the Cold War, that there was a door that had been shut that was then opened. And how I got from Marxism to phenomenology and back is a much longer story, but the short version of that story is that I was very enchanted in 1989 by the Velvet Revolution, really by all the revolutions. But the Velvet Revolution and the very romantic story of the imprisoned playwright who gets to go live in a castle. And that was also a very contingent story because Václav Havel was being beautifully translated by Paul Wilson. It's also a story about translation. Had it not been for Paul's translations, you know, none of this would have happened. And so I was also, you know, I was young. I was a young peace activist. Abby Hoffman had just committed suicide. This is also a very generationally dependent reference. For those of you who know that reference, there was a sense of something having stagnated in American politics, something being very disillusioned, you know, and then this new language that Havel was speaking that was very unlike any language in American politics. And so I became very interested in that history of dissent, in the political philosophy of dissent. And how I became interested in phenomenology was that I went over to Prague and to Bratislava in the summer of 1993 when I was then an undergraduate at Stanford University doing research for a senior thesis on the political philosophy of dissent. And I had this idea at the time that these were the heroes, the human rights activist, the anti-communist. So surely they were all, you know, reading Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and the Federalist Papers and preparing to be good Western liberals. And then I got there and realized that no, they came from a very different philosophical tradition. And that's what eventually led me to phenomenology. You know, from Havel to Patočka to Heidegger to Husserl. It's a very long story, which I won't subject you to right now, although I see some of my students here in my truth and post-truth class who are about to be subjected to Havel, Husserl, Patočka, and all those guys.
I can relate to that Berlin Wall moment because I am from Soviet Union. So you experienced it from books and on theory, but I actually lived it because first time when I left Ukraine, it was Soviet Union was collapsing. It was 1991, and just crossing this ocean, coming to Canada, it was a moment of elation, which we never, you know, couldn't even imagine it would happen in our lives.
So where were you when the Berlin Wall fell?
I was here in Toronto already.
But that was 89. You were here already?
Oh, no, 89.
Yeah.
No, then, sorry, then I was still in Ukraine, in Soviet Union. But I mean, not exactly the moment, but that feeling when you finally free, liberated from that, invisible walls prison. So part of your studying was also totalitarianism. I wanted to ask you why in some countries it's possible to form a totalitarian regime and in others not, and what conditions need to be met, if anything, for that?
No, this is a good question. If I had the magical answers to this question, I always start by saying that you can't do a control study on real life. So historians, in the very best case, can explain what happened, how it happened, who, what, where. We can never decisively say why, because you can't go back and hold certain variables constant in the interest of determining what was actually causal. And so in that sense, it's always speculation. I tend to be very much a universalist about this. I don't think there's any magical pill or magical gene that some countries or nations or ethnic group has that makes them immune and other groups have that makes them particularly vulnerable. I think totalitarianism involves an exploitation of certain kinds of weaknesses and potentialities that are there in the human condition. And then there's the question of chance and contingency. I think that people change through experiences. I think I'm always asking my students to imagine all of the moments when something could have been different. If anything happens to that sealed German train car that Lenin is riding in, and does not get to Petrograd in April 1917, I think arguably there's no Bolshevik revolution and the whole Soviet experiment as we know it doesn't happen.
Yes. That bag with the bomb which was placed beside Hitler.
Yes, there are all those. I mean, now watching what's going on in Gaza, I was in Toronto in November 1995. I was doing part of the 10 months I spent in Toronto, which now I'm sure I've romanticized because I keep talking about it all the time. I did my MA here, 95, 96. I was only here for 10 months. It was a one-year MA. I finished early so I could do an intensive language course in Poland. I spent most of it at Robarts. I didn't really see the city. But it was a very good year. And anyway, I had a close friend when I was here who was in the MA program with me, but who was significantly older, who was a Jew from Soviet Ukraine, from Lviv. And he had defected. He had escaped illegally in the 1980s, and then he was in an Austrian refugee camp, Alexander, and he's sadly no longer alive. And I was asleep the day in November 1995, and Alexander calls me. This is, of course, pre-cell phone for my students here, like pre-internet, landline, in the graduate dormitory. He calls me up and he's yelling and he's like, "Marci, the bastards, they killed him, the bastard." And I'm like, "Alexander, who, what are you talking about?" That was Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. And now I think back to that and think if those bullets had missed, we would be in a totally different world now. And I think that's true with the history of totalitarianism. There are moments where things could go in different directions.
Thank you for this answer. As I mentioned before, I was born in the Soviet Union, so it was actually 1971. Young people don't know, but it was a period of stagnation in the country. Brezhnev was a ruler of the country and of the Communist Party for many, many years. I don't know, since I lived, I remembered him into the 80s, I think. And then I remember my parents whispering in the kitchen about seksoty, which is секретный сотрудник. To translate, it's like secret cooperate. Those were KGB people planted everywhere, basically their ears and eyes. And we used to say that walls have ears. So I'm just telling you all this to realize how we lived. Like we lived in prison. We knew we cannot get out. We knew we couldn't travel abroad. And so we were very happy when Ukraine suddenly became independent and without bloodshed. It was quite a moment, but unfortunately it was short-lived. And then Maidan came, and today Ukraine is also fighting physically at the front to uphold the same values of freedom, of democracy. Because in Maidan, students came out because they were born in free Ukraine. But their parents came, I think, because they are my age. They knew what it was to live in Soviet Union, in this prison. And as Ukraine is fighting now for these values, south of the Canadian border, we see the shift away from these values, shift away from democracy. It seems that Trump is playing by Putin's playbook. So I wanted to ask you, when did you notice the shift happening, and where do you think it's going? I know nobody has a crystal ball; we cannot predict the future, but.
Yes. Okay. So I'm American, so this is like heartbreaking and wrenching. Well, first I would say, like going back to who is vulnerable to totalitarianism, and totalitarianism is an exploitation of possibilities. You know, recently I've spent so much time talking to foreign journalists who say things like, but this couldn't possibly be happening in America. I mean, other places, yes, but not America. I mean, America's always been the strongest democracy, and drink in your liberal democracy. And I'm like, okay, let me just remind everybody that we sent racially segregated troops to fight the Nazis. And we had miscegenation laws in place until 1967. And we were never this, perfect democracy that people imagined that we were, or that we imagined that we were. I mean, these serious structural vulnerabilities. We have the highest per capita gun rate. We have daily gun violence that's unimaginable for Europeans. Like, those things were deeply embedded in American society long before. In terms of, moments when I started to panic, I mean, the first moment, which we'll call this like a precursor, was when Sarah Palin came on the scene in 2008, when John McCain picked Sarah Palin. That terrified me. And I think because I'm a historian of the 1930s, so my immediate visceral response was, this is the old right and the new right. This is Marshal Antonescu and the Iron Guard in Romania. This is Admiral Horthy and the Iron Cross. This is the old German conservatives, and the Nazis. And it takes the old right in the 30s some time to realize that the new fascist right is not just a more energetic, vibrant version of themselves. That like there's actually that the fascists turn, they're a little slow. They think like, okay, they're a little crazy, but they're bringing in some energy. And I saw Sarah Palin, and I was never going to vote for McCain anyway. I'm a person of the left. Like that was never going to happen. But he was not crazy. He was like that was a different kind of conservatism. That was still part of a conversation I could be part of. And Sarah Palin came on the scene, and I thought, wow, she is living in a completely fictitious world, in which she has no sense of constraint and anything is possible, and she will happily rile up a mob to lynch someone. And when I think John McCain realized that at a certain point and got scared, and I think he was relieved in some way when he lost. I don't think he wanted to unleash those demons. I don't think he understood what he was doing. But when they lost, I had this like, okay, something terrifying almost happened, but it's past. Some of you might remember the comedian Tina Fey from Saturday Night Live was doing these impersonations of Sarah Palin. I very seriously thought she should have received the Nobel Peace Prize for her contribution to preventing Sarah Palin from coming so close to the presidency. But that was the first sign. I mean, for me, Sarah Palin was right out of the 1930s. And then then it passed, and then I kind of calmed down. And in various ways, the Obama years were disappointing, but not horrible. And I wasn't paying such close attention. My focus was always on Eastern Europe. But when Trump came on the scene in September 2015 with the first Republican debates, that was when he first came on the radar, and I panicked. And if I panicked sooner than most of my American friends and colleagues, it's not because I was smarter, but because I had been watching what was going on in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, there was such a total unhinging from empirical reality. This whole post-truth, we have alternative facts. And there was a satire in the New Yorker about the fact checker who passes out from exhaustion at the end of the Republican debate and has to be hospitalized. And it was that journalists couldn't keep up because they were used to fact checking individual facts.
Yes.
They weren't used to a complete disconnect from reality. And people thought, I felt like, people on my side, or like, even much more centrist Democrats, didn't take it seriously. They thought there is no way, this is ridiculous, this is comical, this is embarrassing, this is absurd. But I had been watching what happened in Russia, and so I knew that this postmodern, post-truth, version of
twisting of the truth, yes.
Yes. I mean, I knew it could get very dark and very dangerous very fast. So I was an early panicker.
And because we have now social media and so many means more to, for propaganda channels, it's very easy to play with human minds.
It's terribly easy. One thing that really got to me was, it was the first or the second Republican debate, and before anyone thought this was serious, and Trump said something in that debate about how childhood vaccines cause autism and he's not going to make parents vaccinate their kids. I don't know whether or not he believed it. He probably doesn't know whether or not he believed it. He pulled it out of a hat, like as a populist measure. And that terrified me because I knew that, first of all, my children were quite small at the time, so the memory of, this is a very parent reference, but the memory of that newborn stage before they've had their vaccinations, I don't know, it's 2-3 months, they're so vulnerable, right? Like they don't have an immune system, they're dependent on herd immunity. You take them to the pediatrician, you hope nobody else in the waiting room has
Nobody
anything.
sneezes or touches them.
No, it's very scary. And so that was very vivid to me. And I knew that when you say something like that, like if Jason Stanley were here, he would call this asymmetrical authority. It's one thing if you're some guy at a bar and you say it to the person sitting next to you. It's another thing if you are a candidate for the presidency of the United States and you say this in a nationally televised debate. You're saying this in a position of authority. And as a result of this, 100,000 more people aren't going to vaccinate their kids. And some of those kids are going to die. And no one is going to hold that man accountable. It's not even clear to me that should be protected speech. I mean, it's not like shouting fire in a crowded theater because of what you said, other people's children are going to die, and nobody is saying we're drawing a line.
Yes, it's very disturbing what's happening there right now. The Ministry of War, Department of War.
Very Orwellian,
attacks
yes.
on academia and people afraid to criticize Trump. It's very disturbing. Moving on to Ukraine, this is our topic. So how did the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine signal the end of history narrative? And what does this shift reveal about the fragility of democracy, our century?
Okay. So this is also a very generational response. So I think on both sides of the Atlantic, the 1990s was so dominated by Francis Fukuyama's idea of the end of history. So this idea that, okay, communism crashed, but the idea that there was a direction to history was not necessarily wrong. It was just they picked the wrong direction. And so we know there is a kind of locomotive, and it is moving inevitably, inexorably, but it's not moving towards communism. It's moving towards liberal democracy. There's no real ideological alternative. And that was, I found it even at the time kind of condescendingly triumphalist, but not necessarily wrong. There was a sense that these alternatives have crashed, and we now know that, this is the best of all, Voltaire, this is the best of all possible worlds. And okay, there are going to be some bumps along the road, but we're going to get there, and somehow that came with what Adam McNick has called a utopian capitalist package. This idea that, even if only subliminal, that liberalism, democracy, and free market neoliberalism were somehow part of a seamless whole, that all good things went together, and one reinforced the other, and you open up the markets and allow people to trade, and that will make everybody nice, because in their enlightened self-interest, they will see that, of course, it's in everyone's interest to get along, and then you're more economically profitable, and then we all have a nicer life. And this was the huge, like the Germans call this Wandel durch Handel, right? They call it change through trade. And they, like my friend Martin Polak, who is tragically no longer with us, but he was one of the most profound advocates for Ukraine in the German-speaking world, said that we thought we could domesticate Putin, or we could tame him by trading with him. We thought these like enlightened economic relations would just naturally kind of put people on this inevitable path towards democracy. Yeah, and it turned out not to be true. And that had not been true for a long time, but I think it wasn't until February 24th that like the nail in the coffin hit, because it was so inconceivable, I think especially for Europeans, that there could be this kind of huge full-scale land war in the 21st century. I think that was the final moment. There was a sense of this can't be happening, which I have to say, like, even though I was paying intensely close attention and watching it all streamed, and I can't even say, well, I didn't process it because it was 4 a.m, but it was 4 a.m. Kiev time, but it was a perfectly respectable time in New Haven, so I was wide awake, and I couldn't process it. I mean, I was in this paralysis, just, this can't be happening,
I know, we couldn't believe it. Also, we knew already from the news and everything that the arms, the troops are on the border, and my parents live in Ukraine, and I was telling them, come here and come to Canada, no? And when I called my mom, I said, war has started. She started crying. My father didn't want to leave because he's a patriot of Ukraine. He said, it's going to be a treason. 84 years old person, treason to leave Ukraine. In what ways has Ukraine since then emerged as an avant-garde and resisted postmodern forms of tyranny?
Well, this is, I mean, there's the intellectual component and there's the practical component. So one thing that kind of fascinated me about the Maidan, the revolution of 2013 to 2014, and what enchanted me so much is that, I was a student of dissident philosophy, and, which involved a certain kind of resistance to a postmodern turn that insisted that a robust subjectivity was not what relativized truth, but what grounded it. And that truth and the human subject were connected through responsibility. And there was this whole language of truth and responsibility and living in truth, and subjectivity, that had been so important to me, and it disappeared after 1989. Like, just at the moment I got there, it was all over. Everyone was into free market neoliberalism. And for me, the Maidan was the moment that came back. The moment when this idea of the self and decision-making and responsibility and truth took on a very tangible meaning again. And in that sense, it was an anti-postmodern moment. And I mean, I remember having a conversation with a Polish historian friend, and in Polish, the word, there are 2 words for subjectivity. There's subjektywność and there's podmiotowość. So which you can't quite capture in English, but there's the subjective, like what could be relative, but then there's subjectivity, what it means to be a subject as opposed to an object, a responsible agent. And podmiotowość, what it means to be a responsible agent, was a key word for the dissidents, for solidarity. It was an atomic word. It meant to take responsibility, to say that we are not just passive victims of the regime, we are going to decide our own fate. And when the Maidan happened, my Polish historian friend, we were talking, and he was like, wow, Marci, podmiotowość, I haven't heard that word since the days of Solidarność. And so there was a sense that came back, like these pre-postmodern ideas that never quite trickled into across the Atlantic into the States, but was a very particular philosophical contribution. And then people were willing to die for truth. They were willing to die for free. Like, those words had real meaning again. And this return of metaphysics, the return of that which is transcendent of the market and transcendent of opportunism, that moment of solidarity that has never lasted for more than a flicker of a second, but is infinitely precious. Arendt calls it the lost treasure of revolution, that is beyond any victory or defeat. And then, so there was, February 2014, the climax of the Maidan, the sniper massacre, And then within, 36 hours, you've got your little green men in Crimea, you've got, Russian tourists coming across the border, you have titushki, you have people pretending to be that, you have this group pretending to be that, and this person pretending to be that, and nobody knows who is who. And it was like this sudden postmodern invasion overnight. Like you go from modernity to postmodernity in philosophical terms overnight. And so there was that resistance to a certain postmodern turn that I saw had been developed on the Maidan. And then there was this very, very dark side of postmodernism that was coming out with the beginnings of the war in the Donbass, where nobody really knows who is who. And I'm a historian, so I'm always telling stories. People say we have a compulsive desire to narrate. My friend Katya Yakovenko, she was in Donetsk at the time. She's from Donbass. She was a student there in February, March 2014 when all this starts. And she was also one of the curators in what was called Izolatia, which is a word I fear using because that building in Donetsk that had been the former factory that had been their art space was then taken over by the separatists and turned into a torture prison. And so now the word Izolatia, Stanislav Isayev has a brilliant memoir about his time there. It has a very different flavor. But Izolatia, when Katya and her friends were working on it, was an art space, a discussion space. They had gallery openings. Like, it was a nice thing. Like, it was a serious intellectual endeavor. And when I met her, it was several months later, and she had fled to Kiev. And we were sitting in this Japanese tea house, and she was trying very calmly to narrate to me how this happened. Who came when, who came first, who these guys were, who those guys were, who the separatists were, who was coming across the border, and she's like, Marci, and then one day the Chechens came and they didn't even speak Russian very well, and they didn't understand why they were getting hryvnia instead of rubles from the ATM machines. And then they call this meeting on Lenin Square, and this, staraya babushka, this elderly Christian Orthodox grandmother comes out on the square to give an Orthodox christening to the leading Chechen soldier so that he will be victorious in battle against the Ukrainian Nazis. And she's like, Marci, everything is fictitious in this story. They're on Lenin Square. So you have the Christian woman on the communist square giving an Orthodox christening to a Muslim soldier so that he can go kill non-existent Ukrainian Nazis. She's like, it's all fictitious and it's all really happening to us. And this was this dark postmodern turn.
Wow, it's surreal. What responsibilities do intellectuals have in narrating Ukraine's struggle and its avant-garde role?
Huge. Like, we have all possible responsibilities. My personal feeling is that we're all always responsible. We're responsible for speaking the truth. We're responsible for telling stories. We're responsible for trying to hear different voices. Now, maybe I say this because I'm a physical coward, and like, I'm not out there getting beaten up by ICE in the States, and I'm not out there on the trenches. Like, I'm doing really like the only thing I'm able to do in some sense. I would not trust myself to be physically brave. One thing I felt when the full-scale invasion broke out, I felt like the West Europeans were just sleepwalking. Like, they just this attempt to wake them up. And I was like, what is it? Like, what are you not? Like, how is it that people are not?
Yeah, why they couldn't see it?
How is it people are not seeing what's in front of them? And all of my writing has, in a sense, been about that. It's not like I have some profound political analysis and like that other people don't have. And I certainly have no sophisticated military calculation. And the fact that I've even learned what some of these weapons are seems kind of absurdist to me. Like, what do the fact that like at some point I was like going to on the train going to Washington to plead with people on Capitol Hill to send lethal aid to Ukraine. And I had been a teenage peace activist, wearing tie-dye and peace sign earrings at Abby Hoffman's funeral. And one of my former students who's a military officer is texting me like little cheat sheets of the different weapons. He's like, okay, Marci, I try to explain them all as simply as possible. You know, like if it's still too complicated, just call me, you know, and we'll go through it again. Like this is what they need and this is why they need it. So I don't have any of that. Like all I can do is try to shake people into seeing a kind of human dimension of what's going on. What scares me, I'm very skeptical about the notion that the reason why the West, whatever that actually is, you know, has not taken a harder line on Putin is because everybody is too dazzled by Pushkin and Dostoevsky and Russian ballet. I think of everyone I know, I'm the most in love with Dostoevsky. Like, I think in some ways, like, I love teaching Dostoevsky. For me, he is the thinker who illuminates evil, not who obscures evil. But the real danger I see, like the real failure is more of the John Mearsheimer camp of political science, game theorist. We're locked in certain kinds of Cold War paradigms. This is all a chess match. The Ukrainians aren't real people. It's all about great powers. There are only so many squares on the board. If we move here, they're going to move here. And I mean, I've listened to some of these talks and there are no human beings. It's like you're just talking about pawns on a chessboard. And sometimes you've got to sacrifice some pawns to get a rook, and like there's no human element. And so I feel like if we intellectuals are making a contribution, like we should be injecting the human element. We should be reminding people that we're talking about people and shaking them into seeing that we're talking about people. You know, I meant to, I don't know, wanted to is a strong word, to write about the Alaska summit. And I felt like I had no more words to express my disgust. Like I felt like, what can you, like these two men who belong in the dock at The Hague, like rolling out a red carpet for this mass murder. And I felt like and the journalistic coverage, sort of like they're still locked into this Brussels-like polite language. Terrell James Starr wrote like the only really good thing I read about it was very like straightforward and colloquial and like, but I'm like, if you want to cover that fairly, you should be juxtaposing images of that red carpet with images of Russian soldiers tying Ukrainian prisoners to boards and electrocuting them. Like, let's not talk about this like it's a chess tournament, because it's not a chess tournament. Because there's a level of depravity that people need to be shaken into seeing. Yeah, and that I kind of feel like when I'm writing, I'm largely telling stories just to try to shake people into seeing what's going on.
And you mentioned military terms. When this full-scale invasion started, I was asked to translate for CBC from Ukrainian side, and all these military terms, I had to look every one of them, you know, the weapons, the terms, and it hit me, you know, war is really there, and we never experienced it before. We were lucky until now. It's surreal, but
it's completely surreal. No, there's this. I was on this train. I got called by Razum to go down to Washington to these meetings, and I was teaching until that afternoon. And so I got on the train in New Haven. So I had 5 hours on the train to figure out what these weapons were. And I was in texting with all these friends in Ukraine. I'm like, okay, guys, like, tell me what is the one thing you need the most. I'm going to go in there. I'm going to ask for one thing because I think that's going to be most effective. So of course, like my friends in Ukraine are like historians and writers and philosophers, and like, you know, so I'm talking to like lots of people I trust the most. And I was texting with Jurko Trochasko, and we speak in Polish. And you know, this is a little funnier in Polish, but I'll say it. He's like, you know, Marci, I think it's these attackums. But you know, I feel immodest even talking about this. What do I know? I'm like, Jurko, you feel immodest. Imagine how I feel. I feel completely ridiculous. Like, but this is where we are.
That's where we are.
This is where we are. Like somehow, it has to be this way.
Why do you think the West failed to fully grasp the significance of Maidan revolution?
This is a very interesting question. I mean, I would say I would have a different answer for Western Europe and for America. For my own country, Ukrainians ask me this all the time. And I have a very strong, I mean, I'm not an expert on American politics, but I have a very strong intuition. Everybody else in the world completely underestimates American self-absorption. It's an extraordinary self-absorption that Europeans just cannot conceive of. I don't even think Canadians fully appreciate it. Because if you're in Canada, you have to know that there's a rest of the world out there that affects you. Like, Americans really don't. Like, on some very basic level, they don't. I mean, it's not hard to get a passport in America, and most Americans have never had a passport. Because why would you need one? I mean, I grew up in a family where like neither of my parents had ever had a passport. Not because it was so hard to get one and not because it was so expensive, but it's a big country. It's a monolingual country. People have a hard time imagining that things that happen in other languages in other parts of the world are real. So the fact that, it's not like, when Ukrainians are like, everyone is so dazzled by Pushkin, they've never read Shevchenko. I'm like, I assure you, Americans are not dazzled by Pushkin. They have not read Pushkin. Like, they don't care. They don't read poetry. Like, the number of people who care about Pushkin, like, we can count on two hands, and, 95% of them are on Ukraine's side. Like, Americans just think about America. So in that sense, it wasn't anything particular to Ukraine. Poles ask me this all the time, like for decades. There was this interview that my older wonderful colleague Antoni Polansky gave in 1997 to this Polish Jewish magazine that had just started to come out in Polish. And the question was, is it true that in the West people think of Poland as an anti-Semitic country? And Antoni, who is a historian of Polish Jewish history, said, it's true that in the West, people generally don't think of Poland at all. Which is the right answer. I mean, really, like, there's a very small number of people who are even thinking about this. Okay, so that's the American answer. The West European answer, which I was in Vienna at the time during the Maidan, but Olivia Guardalo, who is a Arendtian political philosopher in Italy, translated the Ukrainian Night into Italian. And she wrote a wonderful introduction to the Italian translation. And she makes two arguments there. She says that Western Europe completely failed to appreciate the Maidan, both because they're condescending towards East Europeans, but in some ways still more profoundly because they have forgotten what revolution means. And then she goes on to talk about, what revolution meant for Hannah Arendt, which was a revelation of the human capacity to give birth to something new. Mm-hmm. And to me, this was what was extraordinary about the Maidan. It was a revelation of the human capacity to set in motion something new. And she said, Europeans have forgotten. They've forgotten the revolutionary tradition. They've forgotten what that means. They're on this kind of automated path dependency. And so when a real revolution happened, they didn't recognize it.
They're waking up now.
Slowly.
What does Ukrainian experience suggest about the future of liberal democracy globally?
Does liberal democracy have a future globally? That's a very good question. One thing we should all appreciate is just the fragility. This was what the narrative of the end of history kind of hid from us. It's always been a very, very fragile proposition. Moreover, not only is the free market not synonymous with liberalism and democracy, but liberalism and democracy are not synonymous with each other. People can democratically vote against liberalism, and in fact often have. We see the illiberal democracy, that has happened in Hungary. Of course, the infamous example is Hitler's coming to power in a democratic election. But we're seeing this in America too. This is a heartbreaking thing about the election, to realize that Americans chose this. Americans voted for this. There is no rule of physics. There's no law of physics that says that when people can choose freely, they're going to choose liberalism. So that's one thing. The other thing, for me, a lot of the story of Ukraine is, I'm very much a rootless cosmopolitan. I'm very skeptical about all sorts of genetic explanations that certain people drink in their love for freedom with their mother's milk. I think it's a country that's changed tremendously. I think people have gone through experiences that have changed them. Olha Onuk and Henrik Hill's book on the Zelensky effect. So some of you might know this book. This was a book that came out maybe 2 years ago, into the full-scale invasion, that was based on research done by a group of social scientists conducting large-scale survey research, including Volodya Kulik, our colleague in Ukraine, looking at how attitudes in Ukraine towards democracy, towards the rule of law, towards certain kinds of civic freedoms had changed. And like they actually do things that are measurable. My writing has been very impressionistic, and I tell stories about my friends. But like they actually did large-scale survey research, and the result was that attitudes towards things like, civic participation and democracy and elections have changed tremendously in Ukraine. Like hugely, like in the past decade or so. And for me, that is a reminder that human beings have the capacity to change. I mean, this is part of, Arendt's idea of revolution. There is the possibility of setting in motion something new. And that means that everything is fragile because things can turn quickly, but it also means that we have that potential, And so that in some ways has been heartening. I mean, Ukraine in some ways is my only hope, and in some perverse way, of course, Ukraine's gruesome war has, coincided with the fascist, the fascist descent in my own country. So these things are hard for me now to disentangle. But I was in such a state of despair last year, and really like the best mood I was in, or the best I felt all year, were the days I spent in Kiev. A good part of which I spent in a bomb shelter, so you'd think like it wasn't really so cheery. But there was such a sense of people caring. I mean, I did this public talk there with Volodya Yermolenko, a brilliant philosopher friend, on Hannah Arendt and the problem of evil. And we were doing this it was at the Kiev Book Arsenal, and it was right after the air raid alarm had lasted like 10 hours or something. It was crazy. I thought, like, we're going to miss this talk because, like, you're waiting and waiting and waiting, and it just keeps going and going, and I'm still in this bomb. As a neurotic American, I'm not going to come out until, like, the air raid goes off. But moreover, they're not going to open the Book Arsenal, until the air raid alarm goes off. But the air raid alarm finally goes off, just like, we run over to the Book Arsenal, so everyone's been up all night, and there's like me and Volodya looking also like we've been up all night. And I think, unfortunately, it was filmed because I'm sure I look terrible. But having this very serious conversation about Hannah Arendt and the problem of evil, and is it banal, and is it radical, and how much does the Eichmann paradigm apply? And this room is packed. It's packed with people. It's packed with Ukrainians who have also been up all night, but schlepped over to the arsenal because the problem of evil is not an abstract problem for them, because they really care about working through it.
They experience it every day and every night.
Yes, it's real. And so that gave me, not that, unfortunately, we're talking about evil. It would be nice if we were talking about something more cheerful. But the fact that there are people there who want to think, who care, who are trying, that gave me hope. That was a real moral boost.
And I guess this is more cheerful fact that now in Ukraine, the book business is booming. Publishers printing, the Ukrainian literature is getting translated, and there are festivals, concerts, and events. Sorry, life didn't stop. Yeah. It continues and even exploding. The cultural life is exploding there.
30,000 people came to this book festival. It was it blew me away.
That's great. That's great.
In the middle of a war, there are 30,000 people coming to a book because they care about thinking. They care about books. That was a huge moral boost.
They looking ahead already. After all this horror finished. How might Ukraine's example influence future movements for democracy and resistance against authoritarianism worldwide?
I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful about that. One of all the moving messages I've gotten over the years. So after I'd been writing about the Maidan, and I wrote a long piece for the New Yorker about, this must have been 2015, about reading Tony Judt in wartime Ukraine, which was based on a graduate seminar Yaroslav Hrytsak was doing that it wasn't Zoom then, it was Skype. It was pretty that I was kind of Skyping into, and what it meant for these Ukrainian students who were living through war and revolution to be reading these texts of brilliant, wonderful historian Tony Judt, who I was quite close to, and who died tragically in 2010. And I thought this would have meant the world to Tony if he could have seen these young people. Anyway, I wrote this long piece for the New Yorker. You can look it up if you want. And I get this email from a translator, an editor in Iran, in Tehran. With this, it looked very beautiful to me with illustrations, but of course I can't read Farsi. With this article, Reading Tony Judt in Wartime Ukraine, translated into Farsi. And he sent it to me, and he's like, I just want you to know how much Iranian dissidents have been watching what was happening on the Maidan and how inspiring it's been for us. And that was a beautiful moment for me. I didn't know anything about relations between Iranians and Ukrainians, but the idea that there were people going through horrific, brutal things, in Tehran. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about the Iranian regime. It's not a nice place. Who were watching what was going on in this totally other part of the world and seeing things that resonated, and kind of mentally taking notes, and being inspired by the solidarity and being inspired by the willingness to sacrifice. That meant a lot to me.
That's very interesting. Hopefully Iranian people will take example from Ukrainians.
They've those women who rose up several months into the full-scale invasion, they were so brave, and I thought, maybe this is it. If we could just get a domino effect of these tyrannical regimes falling. I feel the Iranians are giving their drones to the Russians. I'm like, isn't it a time in the movie when the good guys start winning?
Yes.
Couldn't we start getting
when this is gonna happen? I know that you presented today your book, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. It's about Maidan, right? Can you tell me a little bit about your work on that book?
Yes, well, that was a book I never intended to write. In fact, in some ways, I specifically intended not to write it. I was in Vienna at the time. I was on sabbatical. I was working on a book about phenomenology. And I was at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, which is a very special research institute that was founded by Polish philosophers in the early 1980s, really as a meeting place for West European and East European intellectuals during the Cold War. And of course, then the Cold War ended, and so there was no longer the same mandate, but that it continues to have that tradition. So I had several Ukrainian friends and colleagues that year who were doing fellowships at this institute who effectively started commuting back and forth between Kiev and Vienna when the Maidan started. And so there was a proximity, right? Because Katya would get off the plane and we'd be like, so tell us what's happening. And when it was people personally, you always feel things more intensely. People keep saying, are you Ukrainian, or do you come from there, or what's your origin? I mean, the real connection is not through, ethnic, or the connection is through people I've spent my whole adult life now as a historian of Eastern Europe. So these are my friends and colleagues. And when it's people personally who are getting shot, you feel it more because you know them personally. You can't, there's nothing one can do about that. The world is in some ways divided to people you know and people you don't know. But for some reason, I'm sure there's reasons, but a disproportionate number of the leading Ukrainian intellectuals were trained as Germanist, maybe particularly in my generation, and maybe even particularly from Galicia. And so one thing I felt was that the coldness of the response in Austria and Germany was particularly painful. The coldness of the American response less. I mean, the Americans are barbarians. We have no real culture. We're superficial. But the fact that the Germans didn't appreciate. I mean, and of course, the Maidan gets started as Euromaidan, right? This desire, especially for the young generation, to be part of Europe, and Germany is the superpower in Europe, and so the fact that the Germans' attention was elsewhere, they felt particularly painfully, and so I think I absorbed quite a bit of that. But I also felt like I don't speak Ukrainian. I mean, I sometimes kind of fake it by smushing together Czech and Polish and Russian and some Ukrainian in my own personal Surzhyk, but I don't really speak Ukrainian. And I don't work on contemporary politics. And I thought and historians are really only good when we're writing about, things that are already happened, and preferably people who are dead. That's our, it's only looking back that you kind of really get a command over the sources. We're not good in real time. and so I was thinking like, no, I'm not going to say anything about contemporary Ukrainian politics. This is not my field. I'm no expertise. Like I kept saying that. But then I kept being more and more drawn in. And then I kept thinking like, well, what could I do for my friends? I'm in this weird position of being an American in Vienna. So I was following the German press more closely than I would have if I hadn't been in Vienna, even though, of course, now on the internet, you can follow anything anywhere. It doesn't matter. But so I was kind of taking in that coldness. And then I was also taking it in very much in contrast to the Polish response. In some ways, I was very much seeing the Maidan through Polish eyes, which again, I'm not Polish, but Polish is the language after English I feel most comfortable in. And Gazeta Wyborcza had excellent coverage on the Maidan, incomparably better than the English or the German coverage. And I also saw that for that generation, the generation of Adam Michnik, that generation of 68, the generation of Solidarność, those people who sat in prison during the communist period, who forged these alliances between workers and intellectuals, they knew better than anyone else that that kind of solidarity lasted 20 seconds after communism fell. But they also knew it was this precious gift that most people never experienced in their lifetime, and they never necessarily counted on getting to see a second time. And so they really appreciated it. Like they knew what that meant. And so taking it in through their eyes too, I think had a very deep effect on me. Like I remember when I got to Kiev in spring 2014, and I saw a lot of these Polish friends of mine from that generation. Agnieszka Holland was there, and Oleg Smolar, and Adam Michnik, and Kostek Gebert. I remember I saw Kostek, I'd known Kostek Gebert, who was one of the leading activists in Solidarity, a fantastic journalist. I mean, I'd known him for 20 years at that point. I mean, I like to think he's always happy to see me. But when I got to Kiev, he picked me up and twirled me around. There was a sense of something ecstatic going on. And not because they're idealist, but the sense of this reminder of the human potential for something better. And so I really started to think about, could I do anything? Could I tell that story? And then I think it was my Bulgarian friend, Ivan Krastiev, another brilliant thinker, who was really pushing me to write. And he's like, what if you did a profile? What if you did you don't work on politics per se, but you could do a profile of an intellectual engaged revolution. That's the kind of thing And so then I started to kind of strategically think about who I could victimize, as the subject of my profile. And my children were very small at that time. I knew I couldn't leave them for very long. And I decided, I decided to accost Yurko Prohasko, and I chose him for various reasons because he's beautiful Polish, and I didn't want to do it in English because everyone sounds alike in English. Even really good English is kind of Euro English, and I didn't have Ukrainian, and I could have done it in Russian, but I felt better in Polish, and I also knew that Russian was already becoming slightly politically tricky. And Yurko is someone who's, I didn't know him well at all at the time. I had met him once or twice, but we had a lot of friends in common, and I'd followed his writing, and it was a writing I related to. I could imagine okay, if I talk to him for several hours and then I juxtapose these texts, I'll have enough. I feel like I understand his way of thinking that it will be real. And so I went to Lviv to talk to Yurko. It was an extraordinary conversation. We sat in this room for 5 hours, and I barely said anything. I mean, Yurko and Tony Judt are two of the only people I've ever met who they speak spontaneously in full paragraphs. I mean, really, they just comes out of his mouth.
Yurko is a writer.
He's a writer, but I think he's actually one of the great literary figures of my generation who doesn't especially like to write. You kind of have to catch him in conversation. He prefers to speak, and he can speak kind of improvisationally, and so it was so beautiful that I thought, okay, I'm just going to have the conversation transcribed, and maybe I should just publish it like that. But then when I started to do the translation into English, I realized that it would require so much annotation, for anyone else, because there were just too many shared references. that would require for an American certainly, or for a German, would just require too much explanation, then you would lose the whole flow. So then I started kind of filling in different pieces of this portrait. And while I was in Lviv, I also talked to a bunch of other people. So I had like these minor characters. And so I had this essay that I was really thinking about a German-speaking audience for, because I felt like this was something I could do for my Ukrainian colleagues and friends. I could try to make an intervention in the German-speaking press. And I had a wonderful editor from Letter International, and they published it in German at the ridiculously long length it was. They didn't even blink. And Martin Polak, who was on a train in Ternopil somewhere, translated all the quotes from the original Slavic language into German, because I wouldn't let them translate through my English, and they did a really beautiful job. And then I thought, well, obviously I should publish it in English. I wrote it in English. But I couldn't find an American editor who wanted a 15,000-word essay about Ukrainian intellectual and revolution. Everyone okay, if you cut it by 9/10, or if you cut it by cut it at least by 2/3. And then I showed it to one editor, and he said, no, don't cut it. Go back to Ukraine. It should be a book. It should be a short book. And then I started going back to Ukraine and doing more interviews. And it's a book that is. So I say, first of all, I'm a very obsessive compulsive control freak writer. I'm incredibly demanding with my editors. I don't want anyone moving a comma without talking to me first, and that probably involves extensive consultation. And I never co-author anything. I made one exception for CNN about the bombing in Ukraine last year, but I never co-author anything because I want total control to choose every word myself. But at the same time, I think I use a lot of polyphony. So I like to weave in other people's voices, and I like to do a lot of things that are dialogical. And the book on the Maidan was very much a book that owed everything to my Ukrainian friends and colleagues. It's all my weaving in their voices, which involved. It's really a book about my friends and colleagues and the friends and colleagues of my friends and colleagues, which involved an incredible amount of trust on their part of me, which is what was so moving to me. It was very personal, and it was very intimate, and people trusted me, and that's what made it, they trusted me to be able to kind of extract the essence from their voices, or to take hours, of interviews we did and pick a couple moments, and that was going to convey what they really wanted to say. And that's what made it all possible. And I also felt that, what kind of pulled me in was that I felt like, in some ways, I felt like someone else should do it, or someone who was really there should do it, or a real Ukrainianist should do it. But the feeling that they really wanted me, the fact that people trusted me, and they wanted me as that cultural mediator. And I felt like it was something they had done for me, because this, for me, the Maidan was a reminder of everything that caused me to fall in love with Eastern Europe 20 years earlier, and it was something also I wanted to do for them, and so it was very, in some ways it was kind of work of intertwined friendships.
Well, thank you for this book. I feel it's a live document about Ukrainian revolution, and I would like to thank you for this conversation. Before we move to Q&A session, I would like to say that some of you may know, some of you may not. This weekend, the Toronto Ukrainian Festival is happening in Bloor West Village, and Professor Marci Shore is also appearing there at Speaker's Corner. It will be on Saturday at 3 o'clock. So if you would like, or maybe your friends, to continue listening to our conversation, we welcome to the Ukrainian Festival. Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, a fascinating conversation. And what pulls me is what I call the intellectualism. When you talk about phenomenology, the big ideas, the whirling, roiling masses, that people, as you would alluded to, are small ponds, and then putting it in the macro scale. And my question or query, do the politicians get it? Do they understand? Because there's transformative versus transactional. And I'm sympathetic with both. But you are dealing with the history of ideas. You're dealing with values. You're dealing with ethics. You're dealing with what I call fundamental Grundnorms in terms of the basis of humanity and humanitat. And in a good place. And what would you say if you had moments dealing with the mob boss who presents as POTUS? What would you say to him in a language that he could understand? Thank you.
No, this is like how to get politicians to understand. Well, first of all, it very much varies from politician to politician. Like, you know, who is reachable and who is unreachable. If I had to be in the same room with Trump, which is a possibility I dread, I don't think it would even be worth trying. I mean, I think we're staring into just a moral abyss. I don't really think there's anyone there to reach. I just think there's zero moral sensibility. You know, I think it's a mistake. I mean, the thing I've been pleading with both Ukrainians and all Europeans, especially the ones who are politicians, you know, since November of last year, I'm like, do not trust us. Do not think that you can find a way in, that you can reason with this man, that you can appeal to some kind of something. No, there are no first principles, there's no values, there's nothing. You know, everything is purely transactional. Like, and there's no true or false, there's no good or evil. The only categories that exist are what is advantageous or disadvantageous to this man at this particular moment. It can be coincidentally that something he sees as being in his interest at a certain moment has a side effect that's positive for someone else. But that's just a coincidence. I mean, it doesn't mean that you should think there's a principle involved, you know, and think you forged some kind of relationship. And so these European leaders think like, well, we'll flatter him. Well, we're like, no. I mean, I think there's nothing. I mean, I really think, I think you're just staring into moral nihilism. I think there's absolutely, I don't think he's reachable in any way. Now, there are some other people, I mean, sometimes people are reachable. And it doesn't mean that there aren't, I mean, there are people in Washington I would trust personally. But they're not in power now. You know, I mean, I had a really nice conversation with, you know, Jamie Raskin, who like, you know, put everything on the line to try to impeach Trump, you know, the second time, you know, after I came back from Kiev in June. You know, like, you know, Jamie just read the piece I wrote about the arsenal for the New York Review books. Like, he's reachable. You know, he like, you know, it's not nothing. I mean, it's not that no one who's a politician can be communicated with. But there are really some of these, I mean, I think for people like Trump and Putin, I think you're actually dealing with people for whom other people's lives mean nothing. You know, and given that, there's no basis to start a conversation. I mean, the one piece in my life I ever co-authored was with a very close friend, Amelia Glazier, a Slavicist at UC San Diego, who I went to Kiev with last March, and we co-authored a piece for CNN after one night of particularly harsh bombing, when the supplemental aid for Ukraine was being held up by Mike Johnson in the Congress, and it was very targeted and it was very specific. Like, is there anything we can do to shake Mike Johnson into moving, you know? And I thought perhaps, you know, I don't think he's a nice guy. I mean, I think he's someone who's sold to the devil, but there was still that sense of like, you know, okay, you know, there's some nominal Christianity, maybe there's something that can be appealed to here or there. So I think it really depends on the person.
Thanks very much, Marci. I appreciate very much listening to you. And I was particularly struck by what I guess we all commonly know is that generally Americans don't think of us. I'm talking about Canada, not the rest of the world. And I detect a great sense of sadness in your talk today, and your love of all the people in your life that you've worked with and known for the last 25 or 30 years of your professional life, maybe longer. I don't say your age. And of course, you know, looking at, you know, the headline up here, Ukrainians struggle for freedom amidst the rise of Western totalitarianism, I detect from you no hope. Well, that's what I'm detecting from what you're saying and what people are talking. I also detect that, hey, we're talking solely of Donald Trump. as the main instigator. Well, we're talking about the rise of Western totalitarianism. It's not limited to Donald Trump. We have a great rise of totalitarianism in many countries around the Western world, including, not just Hungary, of course, but other countries, and authoritarianism, including Canada, England, you name it. So how is that impacting the ability of the so-called West, to rise to the occasion? And I have not yet, to push back and conquer Putin's Russia, his drive for imperialism. And that's the big question. Yes, we're going to form a coalition of the willing. Well, that's just talk, as you know.
No, there are a few things there. One, yes, no, it's incredibly sad. I mean, it's it's just kind of heartbreaking on so many different levels. I tell another story. So Amelia Glazier, who I actually have been to Kiev with her twice now since the full-scale invasion. But the first big trip we had made together, since we both had kids, like 50, was the trip in March of last year to Kiev. And so Amelia and I were graduate students together at Stanford. And we did a lot of running around Eastern Europe together when we were young and, didn't have students or graduate students, or editors or children or other people, who we were obliged to in our lives. And we were kind of free agents who could, run around and collect volumes of Mayakovsky from used bookstores and ship them back to the States. And we've always been close and we've always read one another's writing, but we hadn't made a big trip together, without kids, in a long time. And we kind of conspired in all last year to try to coordinate our schedules and childcare so that we could go to Kiev together. And so we met at the airport at JFK, and we flew to Warsaw, and then we took the train from Warsaw to Helm, and then we took the overnight train from Helm to Kiev. We're running around Kiev, and on one hand I'm like, this is just like it's always been. I mean, it could have been 2 weeks ago we made our last trip. We're the same people. Okay, we're a little more wrinkled, but we have the same values, we have the same interests. We're still the same people who fell in love with these languages and fell in love with poetry, and we're reciting lots of Mayakovsky. I'm like, so how did it happen that, and it was edgy, in the 90s, and sometimes we were nervous, and, sometimes we would, make up stories to pretend we weren't American if that seemed risky, especially in Russia. The story was always, I was from Warsaw and she was from Vilnius, and that's why we had these strange accents, and it's not like everything was perfect, but there was a sense that things were edgy but not catastrophic. And exciting. And I'm like, so how is it that now we're in this bomb shelter, following missile paths on Telegram channels, sending frantic messages back to Washington, pleading with politicians to immediately send lethal aid to Ukraine? How did that happen? Because I don't think we've changed that much. So it couldn't have been us. But somehow the world has become catastrophic. How did it become catastrophic? How did it become I'm a neurotic catastrophist, and even I could not have imagined 10 years ago what would happen in my own country. So that has been heartbreaking. I mean, I think part of it is, so part of it is you have Hungary, which has sabotaged a lot of aid to Ukraine in Europe. So that's one problem. Fico in Slovakia, another problem. But part of it is the sleepwalking, of the Germans, of the French, and of the British, who are really good at speaking. They're really good rhetorically about declaring support, but it seems to me it's been largely rhetorical. I mean, I think the rhetorical is genuine. I think Macron genuinely likes Zelensky a lot more than he likes Trump, but that's not enough. I never thought I'd be saying this, but you need to be sending those missiles over. They need to be able to strike into Russia. What is going on with the you can have one tank, but not two tanks. And that's a little too much there. And no, the Europeans have to step up. And then their refusal to see what's going on in the States, to think this is bad, but surely we can kind of finesse the situation.
Sorry, the question is, these are not stupid people. Okay? So the question is why you say they refuse to see. Certainly they see. Why do they refuse to act? That's the thing. Is it because of the strong man in Washington? I don't think so. They're strong on their own.
No.
Europe. Arsenal Europe. No. They're strong.
What's your opinion on that?
I
They're
would.
not stupid.
No, they're not stupid, but there is some, I think there's some Freudian denial going on. I think there's some sleepwalking. I think it's very hard for people to break out of paradigms that they're in. But I am open to more explanations. Like, why have the Europeans been sleepwalking? I mean, Inez is French. She has, I'm sure, more insight into the French.